Principal Pathways Advisor at the Office of Sport, Dr. Juanita Weisensteiner. And she is going to introduce our two presenters and the content for this evening's presentation.
Thanks so
Over to you,
much.
Wani.
Thank you, Simon. Look, it is my absolute privilege to introduce our two wonderful presenters tonight, Dr. Sean Abbott and Professor Stephen Cobley. Now, Sean is a researcher in the discipline of exercise and sports science within the Faculty of Medicine and Health at the University of Sydney. In collaboration with Swimming Australia, Sean is investigating how growth and maturation influence longitudinal athlete progression. Currently, he's examining how such influences impact physical and technical performance indices in swimmers and subsequent coach and sports system decision-making. And Professor Stephen Cobley. Stephen, we go a bit way back. I think AIS days 2015, 2016, when we first engaged you at the AIS to put a maturation resource together for national sporting organisations. So it's wonderful to reconnect with you, Stephen, and you and Sean together, and all the incredible work to date you have done, with Swimming Australia and other sports as well. So Stephen's research interests examine the developmental factors that facilitate or inhibit athlete development. And Steve is a very prolific writer, has published many journal articles, many book chapters. He's actually been my editor for a couple of book chapters, so I was very honoured that he was my editor as well. And Steve's at the University of Sydney, and he teaches in the areas of athlete development, motor skill acquisition, as well as sport and exercise psychology. Simon. Yeah, so Steve and I reconnected with Sean in around 2021, 2022, where you could see that there was a gap at the state level in terms of understanding athlete maturation. So understanding how to estimate it, how to measure it, and then importantly, what does that mean for the case management of the young athlete? So in 2022, Sean put together on the left there this very comprehensive resource. It's a wonderful piece of work. Sean, you must be commended on it. It's a fantastic piece of work. And then some great infographics for stakeholders. This is one for coaches. And then way back in February last year, we engaged both Sean and Steve to do a webinar that spoke to these maturational resources, and that was really well received. Now, all those sort of resources can be accessed at our webpage, Pathways and Development, and specific to coaching. Simon. But it gives me great pleasure now, and we're so excited now that we've released a maturation status calculator, and that's been incredible work from Sean and Steve to be able to put this calculator together for the New South Wales sector, but more broadly, the Australian sector and probably internationally as well. And with this maturity status calculator, it gives you a great estimate of an athlete's years from peak height velocity, their percentage of predicted adult height. Now, this is, you click on our coaching webpage on the right where there's the maturation resources. It'll take you to this calculator. And importantly with this calculator, Sean has done some wonderful videos that speak to the measures. And then we have some key information that you should read before you use the calculator, just to make sure you're using it appropriately and effectively. Now, this is the calculator here that we released yesterday. It's live on our website. So that's the calculator at the bottom of the page. And then if you go again, Simon, I couldn't wait. I've used it already with my kids. So this is how easy it is, doing the measurements and putting it in. And there we go. We've got the estimates at the bottom there, which is fantastic. So that's what it looks like. But Steve and Sean are going to go through how to use this calculator. Now, just to finish up, I really wanted to highlight that this has been a collaborative effort internally, but also with Steve and Sean. But I wanted to do a shout out to key people within the Office of Sport that has made this happen. Matt Harwood of the Data and Insights team, Lynn Sear from IT, and then finally the great Matt Adamson from our comms team. And a big shout out to our very own Simon for all his wonderful work in making this happen as well. So I just wanted to thank you all. It's an exciting thing that we're released this tool. And over to you, Sean and Steve.
Okay, that's all up there, Sean. That's good. That's a great intro, and thanks for having us, Juanita. Simon, thanks for the invite again. Just to clarify and confirm on what Juanita said there, is this session is a part 2 to what we did initially, which was to give you an overview about growth and maturation, its importance to assessment and understanding the trajectories of young athletes, why it's important and how it affects performance. So if you haven't seen that information material, I would start there, as Juanita rightly mentioned, and then come to this session, which is all about how do we assess it and the use of the calculator and how can we use it and what can it tell us. That is what the emphasis of this session is. Sean's going to walk you through some steps, and then we can hopefully in the second half tell you, well, help explain how understanding these indices can tell you a lot about what then and what's going to happen with your athlete and how it relates to other facets of performance. So Sean, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So just like anything, what you put into it is what you're going to get out of it. And so that's why it's worth highlighting the key things to remember when taking the simple anthropometric measurements that you need to put into the calculator in order to estimate your athlete's maturity status. So the measurements that you need are standing height, sitting height, and body mass. And as Juanita mentioned, there are videos that go through the instructions in detail, which you can obviously have replay, stop, start, and pause to ensure that you get the measurements as accurate as you can, because although there's some error associated with the estimation itself, you of course want to minimize the amount of error you're making with your measurements. So hopefully if you follow the steps, you can minimize that. So in terms of standing and sitting height, it's worth mentioning that if possible, you can use a studiometer, which is what we recommend. We realise that some clubs and sport organisations don't have access to a studiometer, which is the big ruler thing you can see here. But in the videos, there's alternate procedures to show you how you can measure it just using a wall at home or the clubhouse. The thing you want to keep in mind is trying to keep things consistent, because the purpose of growth and maturation and tracking it is so that you can look at what happens over time. And so if you're changing up your equipment and you're alternating between using a studiometer and not, then you're going to introduce and affect the accuracy of what it is that you're trying to track. So where possible, you keeping the equipment, the general location of where you're taking the measurements, taking note of the flooring, making sure it's a hard level surface, and potentially the time of day, if that can be controlled to some extent. And then it's also worth highlighting, external to obviously referring you to watch the videos, that removing shoes is key for taking the standing height measure, as well as any thick headwear where appropriate or culturally, sensitivity is concerned. But we're talking more about beanies and hats and things like that. And as well as lowering of any hair that might be tied up in a bun, for example, because as you can imagine with the headboard, that needs to be able to compress as closely to the top of the head as possible, and so things in the way is going to affect that. In terms of the positioning, as you can see clearly in the image here, this is what you want to aim for: feet firmly to the back of the base, hips, shoulders, and head are all along the spine of the stadiometer. And the same thing goes for the sitting height. So we've all taken or seen these measurements taken before, so I don't need to go into them in too much more detail. One thing around the sitting height, though, which is probably the main variable where when I'm tracking athletes and I'm getting parents involved in tracking as well, is there's a lot of differences and different takes on how the sitting height's taken. So we do recommend a hard box or stool of known height. So making sure you measure and understand the height of it, because for maturity status, we need to know the athlete's sitting height, and we don't want to go plugging in a sitting height measure that's also including the height of the box or the stool. So once we take that measure, we can then subtract the height of the box or stool from it. The video also shows you an alternative procedure by taking the sitting height by sitting on the ground. The reason for the box or the stool, though, I just wanted to highlight, is that we can have the pelvis in the right position. If the stool or the chair is too tall for the child, so for some kids, you know, we're starting to track or estimate maturity status in girls from 10, ideally. If the stool's too high and their feet is hanging off the box, their pelvis is going to rotate, and then we're not going to get the accurate measure there. So having an appropriate height box or stool is recommended. The head position is also key. So in case you've seen or taken height before and you've let your athlete or child, you know, look up to the ceiling, it's very important that we look straight ahead and have the head in what's called the Frankfurt plane. This is because the highest point of the skull is exposed when we align the head in a neutral position that you can see here. We also recommend using the stretched stature method, and that's because across the course of the day we lose around 0.5 centimetre in diurnal height just from compression of the vertebra, and so the stretch method offsets just over half of this height loss. And so again, just trying to keep to as accurate a height measure as possible. But as you'll see in the video, if you don't feel comfortable doing the stretch stature method that you can see here in the video playing, there is an option to just take it without it. But we do insist that you try to keep it consistent, particularly between your height and your sitting height measures. You don't want to go doing the stretch stature for one and then the non-stretch stature for another. So it's just something to highlight there. Then in regards to the measurements, we recommend that you take at least 2 measurements. You want to make sure that those 2 measurements are within 0.4 of a centimetre. Again, this is highlighted in the video, and for body mass within 0.4 of a kilogram. If it's outside that amount, you want to take a 3rd measure. But when in doubt, you do want to take 2 and at least get the average, because you want to account for possible error. Kids move around a little bit and you want to make sure it's accurate. For body mass, look, you know, the procedures for measuring body mass are fairly straightforward. It's more around the devices that you're using. So where possible, try and use digital scales and place the scales on a hard, flat surface. Analog scales are a bit difficult to determine body mass because we want to record it to the nearest 0.1 of a kilogram. So that's why I recommend digital scales that give you that finite amount of measurement. The pricing ranges. So again, we understand that typical bathroom scales may be used, and that's fine. You just probably want to check that weight against a known amount of weight, like a bag of rice or something like that, to know you're getting a correct reading. And as you might think logically, wearing light active wear, removing shoes and socks, and removing anything from the pockets to remove any dead weight that's going to add to the body mass measurement. And you want to make sure that your athlete's obviously standing still and their feet's evenly distributed. And same thing goes for taking 2 measurements, just to make sure you're getting an accurate measure both times. So now we move into the fun part. Again, I skipped over the measurements because you can review them in more detail and at your own speed. But as Juanita showed you, this is a screenshot example of the calculator, which we'll move to shortly and start plugging in some numbers. But you can see here from the measurements, you're going to obtain what you need in order to feed into the calculator. So if done correctly, you'll have an accurate measurement of height, weight, and sitting height, which you can enter here. There's also some additional information it's going to ask you for: the athlete's sex, date of birth, and the date of measurement. And then also, if known, the biological father and mother's height. And so with all these measures, you're going to get two indices of maturity status. And so by maturity status, we mean the stage of biological maturation of an individual at the time of observation. So the point along their maturational journey where they're at. And we get two maturational status indices from these measures. And the first one is your maturity offset, or your distance from peak height velocity. And that's the chronological distance. So it's the number of years that you're away from the time point in your adolescent period, or the athlete's adolescent period, where they're going to be growing their fastest. And that's useful for us, which you'll see moving forward, because it's a biological marker that occurs early in the maturation process, which identifies other predictable events that are going to occur following peak height velocity. And that has implications for what we as coaches and sporting practitioners can consider in terms of how we nurture and develop our athletes. The second maturational indice, which relies on the biological father and mother's height, is the percentage of attained predicted adult height. And so what this does is it calculates a predicted adult height and then uses the athlete's current height in order to work out how close that individual is to their full adult height attainment. So your predicted adult height reflects the full mature adult state, so full skeletal maturity. So that means an athlete that's got a higher percentage means that they're more mature or more progressed along their maturational timeline, whereas someone with a lower percentage means that they are less mature. And what we should note is that, especially at this point when you start to input information into the calculator, is that we recommend that these measurements or the calculators be used when athletes are between 12 and 16 for males and 10 to 14 for females. And that's just because these are the age ranges where the error associated with the maturity status estimates are their most narrow. So you can use the calculator outside these age ranges, but you need to be aware that sometimes, or in most cases, the estimate error is going to increase slightly. So I'll touch on what that error entails. But typically, if you're using it within these age ranges, you're looking at estimates that are going to have within 6 month error range. So that's and even narrower potentially, because you want to be measuring as close to their observed peak height velocity time point as possible. Okay, so moving on to the interesting part. Let's use two athletes examples here. We have two 13-year-old female soccer players. On the left-hand side, we can see the characteristics of the athlete on the left. On the right-hand side, we can see the anthropometric characteristics on the right. And as you can see, these are the measurements that we need to input into our calculator. So I'm just going to reshare my screen, and you can follow along as well if you would like to also type the measurements into the calculator at home. I'm just going to switch over. Okay, so what I've gone ahead and done is already included the athlete on the right, but let's just go through and do the athlete on the left. So we have a female, date of birth, just scroll up to 2011. Oh, I was already almost there. January and the 5th. And then the date of the measurement was the 1st February 2024, excellent. The average height that we would have taken from 2 measurements, 3 if we were outside 0.4 of a centimetre, was 141.5, and this female was 29.8 kilograms with a sitting height of 75.3. Dad's height, if known, was 182. It can be self-reported as well. There is a correction factor for estimated parent height, but where possible, measuring it once and keeping that record of that is also helpful. The measurements, the estimates should still produce even without biological parent height, but it shouldn't give you a percentage of predicted adult height if we didn't put parents' heights in. So once we click submit the form, we can see here that the distance to or from peak height velocity is minus 0.2 years, and the percentage of predicted adult height is 89.6. So I'm just going to show you now what all that means by flicking back to the slides. Okay, and that should be sharing again. Okay, so here we go. So based on the calculator results, we can now identify each player's respective maturity status. And as you can see here, we've got the maturity offset measurement of minus 0.2 years from PHV, a percentage of predicted adult height of 89.6%. In our female on the right-hand side, we can see that this female is 2.95 years from peak height velocity and 99.2% of their predicted adult height. Now, what this means is that at the time point of our measurement, our female on the left had just turned 13, while our female on the right is almost 14 years of age. Now, the maturity offset of a minus 0.2 indicates that she is yet to attain her time point of peak growth, her peak height velocity. So she has a few more months before she attains it. And so right now she would be experiencing accelerated rates of growth. She'd be within her peak growth period. And you can see that this green curve reflects her peak height velocity curve. So you can see that it's occurring later than the black curve, which is our normative expected rate of growth in centimetres per year as females get older. Meanwhile, for our girl on the right, we can see that a positive 2.95 years means that, yes, you can see that she's 2.95 years past her time point of peak growth, her peak height velocity. So that's what that number is reflecting there. Then if we have a look at the percentage of the predicted adult height, it's showing us that the girl on the left has nearly 11% left to grow of the height she is now. And so she is further back on her maturational timeline compared to our female on the right, who is almost fully grown. And you can see that here in the expected or typical growth curve, where the time point of where our girl on the right is means you can see that almost 0 to 1 centimetres per year is what she would be experiencing at this point. And that's important to note, and remembering that you've probably got within a 6-month range of when this maturity offset value could be. It's more accurate when we actually measure and track the growth, the height growth along the growth curve. But because we're just doing a once-off measurement estimate, it's typically within 6 months that it could be in terms of its variation. But it is enough for us to identify the maturity stage that the athlete is at. And so we can do that here. So once we have our maturity status information, we can use it to classify individuals according to whether they are pre-peak height velocity, circa peak height velocity or around peak height velocity, and post-peak height velocity. So for both boys and girls, because we're not talking about chronological differences, we're purely looking at each boys and girls' distance from their peak height velocity. Circa peak height velocity, when using these equations, we recommend using the range of between -1 and +1 years from peak height velocity. So once they get to within that year, you're talking about they're around the time things are about to change and get going in terms of their growth. Anything before 1 year, peak height velocity, we're talking about pre-peak height velocity maturity stage. And then post is anything after 1 year post PHV. The percentage of predicted adult height also aligns to some extent to the peak height velocity stages. And so that just helps contextualize it. It's a different measure, but still, if you're getting a percentage of predicted adult stature or height of between 85 and 95, you're around the peak height velocity time. Anything less than 85 or greater than 95, you're looking at pre and post maturational stages. If we know how far away we are from peak height velocity, we can get an idea, obviously, of when peak height velocity occurred or the age at which it occurred for each athlete. And that helps us give us some information on maturity timing in terms of when maturation starts to kick off in this stage, in this example. And so you can see here that the athlete B is our early maturing individual who had a peak height velocity age of around 11 years of age, and our late maturer, if you look back at the calculations, would have attained her peak height velocity later than 12.5 to 13 years of age. And so this has implications for us to understand what could be happening when for each of our athletes. And this is an example of it. So now that we've got these measurements and we have an idea of at least what they're telling us in terms of their maturation, it's now starting to think about how we can use this maturity information to inform our coaching. And so from a physical performance development context, the first thing we want to understand is that there's non-linear relationships between maturation and each of the relevant contributing physical indices that might be relevant to your sport. And so I've just included a few as an example, but there's a greater list in the resource. And the main things that I've included here is a cardiorespiratory fitness. So we're talking about VO2 max or performance in a multi-stage fitness test, muscular strength, looking at the force producing capabilities of the muscle. In this case, it's the forearm flexors, and then power, the capabilities for the muscles to perform this amount of work as a unit of time so quickly. The other thing that this is going to help us do is it's going to help us understand that generally the performance of each of these physiological systems is going to improve as athletes progress to the mature state, but it's going to be different for each physiological system in terms of when those improvements accelerate and the time points that they accelerate. So, and that's tied to the maturational stage that they might be at to some extent. So within the table, there's two things to first take a look at if we're just looking at the physical part of it, and that's the percentage of the maturity-related gains in that performance indice that's been accumulated. So you can see here for the late maturer, based on purely explained by the progression of maturation, the cardiorespiratory system or performance in that particular test is around 67% of its total maturational attainment. Muscular strength 45, muscular power 71. It's not necessarily the numbers per se, but what is useful to this is plotting your athlete onto the general trend curves, which I've derived these from in the resource, to get an idea of where the athlete could be heading and to help explain what maturation might be contributing to in terms of their performance. Because you can see here the early maturer has basically attained 100% of everything that they're going to out of maturation. So maturation has effectively cesated and finished, and so that any further development and progression is likely now going to come from training intervention, whereas our late maturer is going to be deriving a lot of their performance progression purely from natural biological progression as opposed to training, physiological-based training intervention. The second thing to highlight is the trajectory that they might be on. So what this just means, denoted by the number of arrows and the colour, is that what's in store for the late maturer, because they're currently in a pre-peak height velocity stage, is completely different to what's in store for someone at a post-peak height velocity stage. So in terms of cardiorespiratory fitness, which gain in that system and performance peaks around peak height velocity, they're in store for a greater attainment and gain in that area. Similarly, we've got strength, which typically occurs anywhere between 1 to 2 years post-peak height velocity. And again, we can talk about this in greater detail, but for want of more time, I'll leave that there. But you can see here that because maturation has aided, a lot of the trajectories from the performance that's going to be gained from maturation is starting to level out, and there's not going to be too much gained, which means that there are differences in training influences and contributions that need to be considered at different stages of development. And remembering these two athletes are both 13 years of age, so well and truly could be training together, but gaining a lot of different things from the type of exercise and activities that they're doing. From a movement competency and skill perspective, what's in store again for each athlete based off the maturity stage is going to be very different. So in terms of flexibility, there's a lot of changes that are going to be occurring for someone at pre-peak height velocity, because there's going to be changes in bone length and the biomechanical stresses that are occurring at the joints because of the way the bones and the skeletal muscle tend to grow in sequence. And what that can do is that can potentially lead to both desirable and undesirable increases or reductions in range of motion, meaning that performance could be impaired by reductions in range of motion, but also a movement stability can be impaired because laxity of the ligaments is potentially going to occur. So that's particular for sports with ground reaction forces involved in power generation and directional changes of movement. The next thing is movement coordination and efficiency. So what we're talking about in terms of movement coordination is that generally there's going to be potentially a period of impaired movement coordination when we talk about things like leg stiffness and vertical stiffness, so the ability for the muscles to absorb, store, and then generate force efficiently. And then let's talk about technical skill, which actually we're sort of considering more about the athlete's ability to solve a particular movement task in order to perform. And so we tend to see that things like technique aren't so tightly related to maturity, meaning that for coaches, these are always things that can be modified. There's a lot here, I know. And then, so what this means for us is by knowing the maturity stage of the athlete is going to have implications for particular time points of when we might want to rethink the way our athletes are learning movement, so phases of movement relearning. And then there's also considerations for modifying training load at particular ages and stages of peak growth. Who's this? This is you, Steve.
Yep, just click on one more, Sean. All right, folks, so what Sean's talked about so far is a lot started to get into how the indices can tell you a lot about the trajectory and what's going to happen next, or where there's going to be more or less development for a particular type of athlete given their maturational stage. Now, what I just want to add on to that for in a summary for this session is to highlight that when the athlete is then going through these pre-peak and then post-PHV stages, there's also an injury risk that changes. So just click on Sean, bring those categories up. So when we go into PHV, that 1 year pre and post that peak period, there is such change in anthropometry and physical capabilities that it increases our injury risk. And it's quite ironic that this is also the time in a lot of sports systems that competition levels and selection are starting to be really introduced. And so the capability for a lot of young athletes to engage more intensively and feel that they're making more progress development, so they get excited by that, and the number of competitions and types of involvement they can engage in also maximizes at this stage. The problem is, because the body is going through so much change, it also introduces increased injury risk. And I'm speaking generally here that within that mid-period where we know that the bones are growing, particularly lower limb to start with, we see lower limb lengths of femur, tibia, etc. Those are growing faster first, before then we see later then the upper body start to grow in terms of its tempo. The problem is then in those areas we start to see some common injuries which can occur, which includes Osgood's and Sever's disease, types of situations where on the growth plates on bones, tendons are starting to be become inflamed, and we see lots of pain in runners or impact sports there. We see situations where injury risk is increased just from the athlete non-contact injuries, but actually the risk of pulling growth plates off the bone. So these are known as apophyseal avulsions in synovial joints and on the edges around synovial joints where we've got those attachments. And then we've got types of fractures, which can be in the start with in the lower limb. So where you've got the first box of fractures, that's because the lower limbs are starting to grow at increased rates first, followed by then the chances of heightened injury risk from fractures in the upper body when the spine is starting to then grow as well. So in different sport contexts that you guys are involved in, some of those risks are very real because of the nature of the demands. And so from my background in football, we see a lot of these types of injuries, overuse injuries, start to appear if you've got high impact, ground impact, such as Osgood Slatters in football, because you've got that combination of potentially being highly intensively involved and you've got the demands on the lower limb, knee, for example. When you start to then go into phases of post-PHV, this is also a vulnerable time for injury in particular sports, because we see body mass gain that occurs on top of that stretching of bone length. The muscle itself is now being stretched and becoming more tense. So we see collation or risk of strain injuries. And then we also see the risk through what Sean was saying with laxity in the ligaments and then the possible loss of coordination and skill at this time can then increase the risk of joint injuries such as meniscus and cartilage problems. So coupled with weight gain, coupled with those other changes in anthropometry, we see these increase in general risks occur. Added on to that, if we have a greater growth tempo at this phase, the risk of these injuries can be also added. The other point to add is that if you are a late maturer, the nature of these injuries, you're still to come into these peak growth phases, possibly like our case study, but our late maturers actually are more likely to get a contact injury. So if they're in a field sport and they're typically engaged in physical contact with an equivalent age group peer who is an early maturer, they're more likely to be injured, the data is telling us, from physical contact types of injury. Whereas here we're talking about non-contact injuries just through someone going through normative growth and maturation. So good decision making needed here around at the time when we get most excited about sports, when we're seeing these big changes. We also need to be aware that actually this is also a high point of vulnerability, and we have to do a lot of movement and technical proficiency work and minimize actual training and competition loads if we want to see long-term athlete development prevail, or at least with less burden. Sean, over to you.
Thanks. And in our best efforts to show the widespread utility of how maturation can be related to multiple facets of how we approach the way we develop our athletes, another example is using strength and conditioning, which is something that a lot of coaches will venture into at some point across their athlete's journey, whether it's from an an injury prevention perspective in response to what Steve's just highlighted, or from a performance progression perspective. So to help paint the picture here of how maturation can be considered when looking at how we might structure generally a strength and conditioning program according to the maturity stage, what you've got here, first of all, is to understand when you're going to be seeing natural progressions in muscular strength and being aware of where they're at in relation to the velocity of their growth, so that we can, first of all, understand where movement may be potentially compromised and where it's important to start considering that changes in body segments have occurred, which can inform the way we instruct different exercises. And so this black line here, once again, you might be getting sick of it a little bit now, but hopefully familiar to you, is the peak height velocity curve, where maturity status is 0, indicates that high point there. But the blue line here and on this axis is the strength velocity plotted from hand grip strength, which is something that's easily controlled from a young age up to the older ages, meaning that longitudinally we can get good data from it. And you can see here that it's not really until 1.5, 2 years does hand grip strength really take off. And so obviously this is all quite detailed to the sense that lower limb, upper limb, distal muscles, central muscles are all going to start to increase at slightly different times. But here we're looking at hand grip strength, and you can see that it increases at around 2 years post PHV. And so what that means for when we're considering what we do in terms of strength and conditioning is that at the younger ages, pre-PHV, on the whole, athletes are also chronologically younger. So this is often a time when you're introducing your athletes to strength and conditioning modes of activity as well. And so the emphasis is on learning how to train. So getting them to understand their bodies through a variety range of skills and movements, but also introducing them to the movements that you might want to introduce them to later down the line when you can start progressive resistance training, for example. This is the critical point, right? This is when growth is at its highest rate. The long bones are increasing. The leg bones go first in terms of their growth earlier on in peak height velocity, and then later you've got the trunk length at its highest rate. So at different points, you're going to see potential different disruptions in the limbs that are occurring. And so this is a time where reducing the load, or not necessarily introducing high load just yet, is to be considered, and training to learn. So this could be when training, strength and conditioning is prescribed around improved awareness of their body, proprioception, that sort of thing, reconnecting with their bodies, particularly if your athlete has experienced heightened growth tempo. And this could just be acute bouts and acute adjustments to your programming. Obviously, can always have a progressive nature, but it's just that the emphasis and the purpose of your prescription is going to be slightly different. And then post-peak height velocity is still an area for consideration, because while the other two stages haven't had heightened rates of biological strength accrual, and they've been generally quite linear in terms of strength development, there's going to be a rapid reacceleration in strength in this instance around this time. And so training influences are possibly not going to be as influential as maturation is at this stage. And so it's important to utilize the biological progressions in strength that you might be getting and teaching the athlete how to harness it, because remembering the stage of development these athletes are also at, particularly for girls, is girls have experienced rapid rates of increased height, but then immediately after that, they experience increases in weight, similar to boys, but girls also experience gains in increased fat mass, for example, which is going to be non-functional and alter their biomechanics potentially. So getting them to understand how to efficiently utilize their strength relative to their body weight is very key. And so hopefully these highlight to you that there are time points for modified training loads and emphasis. So we're talking about movement proficiency and potential relearning. Over to you, Steve.
So hopefully you've got a feel for how you can use the maturity indices and where an individual athlete is at in their journey to give you lots of implications for how it can then inform other forms of practice. One thing that we wanted to finish on here is just to highlight how not to use the maturity status calculator. And we get questions around this quite a bit. And I just want to highlight that using the online tool and the information shouldn't be used for diagnosis of any growth problems or detecting some extreme outliers in growth or delay. This isn't a clinical tool. It's used as an estimation to estimate around where the growth points are and where we are relative to our potential adult height. The second point is to make sure you're not using it for short-term performance selection. If you're using this as possibly could be misconstrued, which is to find early maturers for a short-term performance gain, well then you're very myopic in the way you're viewing athlete development. And if actually this should be more encouraged to be looking at the holistic long-term athlete development journey which athletes are going through. And if we want to be better at nurturing and giving a more positive experience through this youth adolescent period, then we can use this information in a very positive way. And second to that, I don't want you to think that using either adult weight height or then a weight estimate, a measurement alone should be used as talent identification or an evaluation tool. As you know, a measurement of weight in sporting systems, for many of you will be aware that is a very sensitive topic at this moment. And so if you are going to be utilizing this protocol, we highly recommend that you highlight clearly the purpose and intent for why we are taking that measurement. And the purpose is only so that you can estimate maturity status. In no way should you be using weight indices alone as an evaluation tool, a talent identification tool, or should it inform selection. Likewise, if you're only using height, well, then you've got a very narrow view of how of what performance entails if you think it centers around purely just looking at height as a key marker. The final thing is we get a lot of conversations from adults around, once I know this information, should it be able to tell me that they're not going to be good for XYZ sport? Should I be transferring my child across? And that, again, is an example of, I would say, well, if you're going to take the autonomy and the voluntary and the fun and engagement nature of sporting involvement away from the child, you're misusing this calculator. We're trying to facilitate the journey and the navigation of a journey through a turbulent period. We don't want adults to be using this information for driving their own concerns and investment towards orientating a path for their child. So I just want to be a bit more clear and stringent on that. I think the green message is much better. We want to be using this calculator and these indices as a way to understand what is happening in the other areas, the other anthropometric physical performance indices that we are interested in as part of performance. And of course, the psychology that goes with it as well. And if we're getting better understanding of how we can take people through that journey, that's going to be much more powerful. So I'll just finish on that, Sean, if that's okay.
Yeah, no problem.
So I think we should hand it over to questions. Juanita, Simon.
I concur. In the chat box, we so far have 4 questions, and I think you've already addressed the first one, Stephen. But you might, if you don't think you've fully addressed it, then please feel free to add what you've said. Hi team, this is great. Are there guidelines around asking athletes under the age of 18 for their weight?
Sean, do you want to come in?
Oh yeah, I'll add my bit first then. Well, it depends on who's taking the measurements. So from a sports perspective, we've been lucky enough with Swimming Australia that, I mean, we've been able to be involved in collecting the measurements. So athletes opt to participate. So by doing it so voluntarily, they are aware that they're comfortable having their weight measured. And as Steve mentioned, knowing that it's only for the purpose of maturity status calculation. So once they have that information, weight shouldn't be kept on record because it has no other relevance as to what we would do next. But in terms of other sports and other athletes and parents interested in doing tracking, it's the parents that we have conduct the measures. So we show them how to do it, and then they do the tracking and share that maturity status information with the coach. So the coach can upskill in, for example, the content that we've shown tonight, but they haven't explicitly been involved in taking the measurements, if that makes sense.
I think if there's sensitivities around that, it's better for the athlete and the parent to do that and do it in private. So, and also just make sure clear the purpose and intent for why you're collecting that information. And if you keep it to the purposes that we're intending for purpose, and you can then provide summary information back to the parent and the athlete about, here's what this is saying and here's how I'm going to use this, then you've got an open triangular conversation, which is going to work very well and safeguard the athlete from any potential negative uses of that information.
Okay, well answered, guys. The next question was from Jimmy. I understand how this is used for younger athletes. However, are there outliers like athletes who start having a growth spurt at age 18 or above?
Well, I think we definitely see a lot in our data. We've got athletes that are still growing way beyond 18. So tonight we're talking about general patterns of progress. We've said, yes, there's early and late maturers, but we certainly do have late maturers, although there are fewer of them in youth sport, and you can imagine why that is based on what Sean's talked about. But importantly, if we can keep more athletes engaged in the system for later, and we do have athletes who will continue making developmental progress up in 1920, but we also have athletes who have a lot of growing to do. So we know that they're going to be tall anthropometrically, and so they might start also their journey earlier and make progressive gains on gains on gains. So we do see very unique patterns, not just this general curvular trend. We see different kinds of curves, and we see people who have high growth tempos, low growth tempos. So the rate at which they go through this whole process is quite varied. And your skill as a practitioner is to be able to capture and understand that and move out of this dogmatic thinking of treating everyone in a similar way in an annual age group. That's the problem that we've got in the sports system at the moment, is that annual age grouping stops us from understanding and seeing that journey and how unique it can be.
Excellent. Okay, I think I can have a crack at answering this next one, actually. Does the calculator provide the graph as a visual in terms of the results when we input it? I can't see that it does. Well, no, it doesn't actually do that, Elaine. It provides you with the number. I think Sean was providing the graph to give you a visual illustration of what it meant, to give you greater understanding of what the figures meant. How did I go there, guys?
Yeah, great. Yep. It's a once-off estimate is going to help you out. If you want to generate the actual height velocity curve, there's a way to do it, but you've got to track height and growth, which you're going to be doing anyway. Yeah.
And the last question is based on these. This is a touchy one. Based on these findings, would you suggest grouping athletes based on maturation results rather than age? Obviously, this has implications in the school environment and
yes,
other areas.
Yeah. So short answer for it is yes, it has massive implications in schools, and it has for all sports systems. We have different strategies that we've highlighted in the resource that you can use. And of course, the type of strategies or ways of rethinking about grouping athletes and what you do with this information, different strategies could work for different sports, depending on the demands of the sport, age groupings, and etc. So, for example, we use some strategies in swimming that are very unique to swimming called corrective adjustments. There's biobanding, which is actually the grouping of athletes into their biological stages or ranges. So that takes away the annual age grouping and it puts them into a biological group, which which collapses across age groups and puts athletes into their developmental stages. And there's other strategies in between, right? So even just starting by measuring and tracking and understanding where your athlete or athletes are is the first step in this journey to rethinking about what your athletes where they're at and what they might need for their next year or years ahead.
Can I just add there also that there are further factors and physiological factors to be considered here. sociological factors and the maturity of the emotional maturity of the athletes involved are important factors to consider, whether you're separating them from their friendship groups, whether they're able to develop leadership capabilities that you put them up into higher age groups, those or maturity status with athletes who are older, because that's where their maturity status is. All these things come into consideration, and there's no one answer to that question. But if you consider all the information in the resource, it will help you steer you towards making the best answer you can.
Yeah, and we're happy to also continue those conversations and ideas about what strategies might be best.
Okay, we've had one final question thrown in, and we do have we're not too far past 7. Sorry, last question. During aging, where there is risk of injury, how much should they back off the training load? Is there a certain guideline?
You throw it to me. Being across the research that's coming out at the moment it's at the stage of surveillance of injuries and aligning that with particular growth stages. I haven't seen any interventions to look at injury load, but that could be because at the moment I'm looking at research that's tying it to maturation rather than looking at youth athletes through chronological as they get older. So from my knowledge at the moment, there is no prescriptive detail as to what amount, frequency and load, but I'd like to have a look for it.
Yeah, I think also it would come down to a combination of things. It would come down to what's happening, how much engagement, for example, and what's the capability of the person we're talking about, what sport and context and what demands are in that context. And then based on what kind of risk or injuries we're talking about, that then combines those 3 points together, and we'd start to say, okay, if we've got someone who is looking like they've lost coordination, they've got high growth tempo, they're in the peak height growth period, they're playing football, knees look stiff, legs look stiff when they're moving, and they're not changing direction very well, I'm thinking straight away injury risk. And I'd be looking at, well, a reduction in load, 20% of load. Well, if he's playing three times a week, training 4 times a week, you're already looking at a lot of volume and possible intensity in what they're doing. So there has to be some decision making about what is 20% enough, or is it what do we need to reduce down? Ultimately, a reduction in training load is an appropriate step. To what degree that would look like is hard to determine, but any signs of pain and disruption and discomfort are a clear guideline that there's something perhaps not quite right.
Yeah, because you're monitoring during that period. So hopefully you're looking at signs and symptoms from the athlete and looking at their growth. And sometimes you can sort of reverse engineer it a little bit by knowing where they're at in terms of their maturity stage, knowing what the risk of injury is and the etiology of that injury. So a lot of injuries can be at the site of the growth plate due to higher repetitive stress. So one thing you don't want to be giving your athlete is higher repetitive movements with high impact. So it's thinking about it that way at the moment, as opposed to knowing how many reps, how many sets, how much time spent on things, which I haven't seen yet.
Okay, I think it wraps up all the questions there, guys. So thank you very much for your presentation this evening.